South Africa is perhaps the world leader in DEI at the moment. There are in place the most extensive race-restrictive policies anywhere in the world. These include forced ownership transitions based on race. Then there's also DEI for hiring. There are, since earlier this year, explicit quotas in place for women and for men and for black and for white. And the only thing that doesn't actually have a number on that spreadsheet is white men. And then you have DEI for mergers and acquisitions. So if US companies want to buy something in South Africa, they're going to face DEI requirements from the Competition Commission. So enough black ownership or enough black hiring and so on. That can determine whether your deal gets approved or not.
I'm joined today by Piet le Roux, CEO of Sakeliga. Sakeliga is a structured vehicle working to protect property rights, infrastructure, and more in South Africa against a backdrop of state failure. Sakeliga has around 10,000 members, well represented among the Western business community in South Africa. Piet is a good friend of New Founding, a very busy man. I'm very glad that I was able to corner you out here. Thank you for joining the New Founding podcast.
Happy to join you. I've watched several of your podcasts, Nathan, and it was good to have a quick visit at New Founding a few months ago, and impressed by your work.
So you've called South Africa ground zero for global DEI. What did you mean by that?
Well, South Africa is perhaps the world leader in DEI at the moment. There are in place the most extensive race-restrictive policies anywhere in the world. These include, perhaps the most famous one is called Black Economic Empowerment, or BEE. The word empowerment can catch you off guard because it sounds good, but actually it's very simply focused on forced ownership transitions based on race. And the government implements those. There are various restrictions when you do contracting with the state at the national level here in South Africa, or otherwise increasingly just directly business-to-business transactions. So if you want to do, if I want to have a license to be a real estate agent now, that gets tied to BEE. Now we're fighting that, but that's the one thing. Another example of why, so it's like there's DEI for ownership. Then there's also DEI for hiring. There are, since earlier this year, explicit quotas in place. Basically, you have to run your business off a spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet has lots of columns and numbers and variables for women and for men and for black and for white. And the only thing that doesn't actually have a number on that spreadsheet is white men. So you get to what the quota for white men is if you subtract everything else from 100. So then you get to 4% or something. And the idea there is that white men should not be more employed than their share of the national population. So that's DEI for hiring. And then you have DEI for mergers and acquisitions. So if US companies want to buy something in South Africa, they're going to face DEI requirements from the Competition Commission. So normal competition law is problematic enough. But in South Africa, you're actually, the most competition law right now is actually on whether you have enough black ownership or enough black hiring and so on. That can determine whether your deal gets approved or not. So those are just three examples of why we call DEI the DEI capital of the world, I think.
So the government in South Africa is trying to basically, bring down, let's say, the percent of jobs jobs and businesses that are in the hands of, in this case, white men, to around 4%. In the American context, it's just absolutely shocking to think about that aggressive of a racial policy. And I guess my question is, like, how did South Africa get here? Can you maybe help contextualize for an American audience the current situation in South Africa and the journey to it?
There's a risk here that if I start, there was just a few podcasts like Tucker Carlson with Vladimir Putin, and it can last a long.
Are we starting in Amsterdam, or are we starting in?
We could start with sort of the fall of Rome or something.
Yeah.
But let's not do that. I'm going to give you a short version. So South Africa is today a country of 60, 70 odd million people, and there are about 5 million white people in the country, and then that you could call that the most Western-oriented part of the country, and then there are several about a number of Western-aligned people and so on. But the country today is very large, 1,700 kilometers from end to end. So in Europe, you'll cross several countries from one end to the other. It's like I think it's something like the distance from Paris to Moscow or something. It's quite a way. So it's this huge country with very different population groups, but it had been settled for several thousands of years, and let's say in the last 1,000 years or so, by various Bantu groups, black people moving down from Central and East Africa. There have been, even before that, and in other parts of the country, people of different, called the San and the Khoi. And then the country was fairly sparsely populated in various regions, depending on rainfall as well. South Africa has also some areas are very arid and some are lush vegetation. So then, according to the current government, all the bad things start happening in 1652, when a guy called Jan van Riebeeck, who was working for the Dutch East India Company, starts a refreshment station at the Cape of Good Hope. And from there on, the country starts. It's never really a colony. It only becomes a colony in the early 1800s when the English take control over the Cape, makes it a Cape colony. By then, there had been many Westerners settled in the area and doing agriculture and so on, but not having moved inland really, only in the Cape, sort of southwest area of the country. And then toward and during the 1900s, there's inward migration, also lots of conflict between various groups, black groups and other groups in the country. And so during a period of conflict and some wars, even with the English, the Afrikaners had their war with the English. We end in the 20th century with a period called apartheid. And during that period, South Africa, well, actually before that period, under the English, it becomes one country. So South Africa has only been one country for just over 100 years, basically since 1910. Before that, there have been various republics and colonies and tribal areas and so on. But for the last just over 100 years, it's been one country. Well known during that time was under the so-called National Party rule, was a policy of apartheid, and that was that various groups in the country were fairly restricted in what they could do, where they could work, who they could hire, where they could live. It was called apartheid. Lots of opposition to that. That's unsustainable, controversial, harmful, gets unwinded in the 90s. And the ANC comes to power. The ANC is the current party in government. Technically, it's currently a coalition, but they're still the leading party. And we turn to this DEI version of what we described, and also, unfortunately, very incapable state administration. So today in South Africa, you'll find pockets of excellence, as you may have seen during your time here, Nathan, but you'll also find various forms of state failure and state collapse. And so it's a mixed bag today with lots of problems, but also lots of people who add great value, make good money, and who want to stick it out and make it work.
Yeah, we've been talking here about what we're calling the narrow corridor, which is essentially the idea that the default position of anywhere on the planet is this state of nature where it's just chaos, corruption, and the rest. And it actually takes a very significant effort on behalf of very serious people in order to form institutions that actually work for people. You need virtuous leaders in order to actually have the courage to do the things that need to be done and the rest. And I should actually, as an aside, just mention that you guys have very graciously been hosting me here in South Africa. So thank you, Piet and Sakeliga, for this. It's been an excellent learning experience, just understanding the dynamics out here. But I think what I'm curious about is, like, where do you see the most possibility for pro-civilizational impact out here in South Africa? We've talked about the situation in government as sort of approaching state failure. Some would argument whether it's already there or not. You could sort of look across the law, the church. There's private security groups. There's also the business community. Like where, what horse are you attaching the wagon to?
At Sakeliga, our mission is to restore economic order, and we can't solve for all the problems, all the political, all the religious, all the problems that, all the challenges of what makes for a flourishing society. And so we've picked a subset of that, and that's reform the economic order. And we think that if we can solve for that, some of that will spill over into better arrangements for a sustainable future in this country. But it's also necessary to ensure that the material requirements of communities can exist so that they can maintain themselves, and also so that they can resist encroachment by the state, or that they can fill the vacuum of state failure. There's a word we use in South Africa. I think Sakeliga actually introduced it. We call it state proofing, and that's currently one of the most important things you can do in South Africa, thinking about whether it's in your venture investments, whether it's in your normal business operations, whether it's in your family life or in your communal life. You have to think through the scenario of what if the state is hostile to me. I mean, that's one thing. That's one thing enough. But the state's also very incapable. What if it doesn't ensure water in the pipes, or the roads don't get fixed, or crime becomes a problem, or the electricity fails? How do you state-proof that? And that's at the material level. But of course, then there's also the implications for loss of law and order. And so I think increasingly in South Africa, it's like the R&D possibly for some areas of the West. It's like the R&D of what happens in multi-ethnic societies, where the institutions of political reform and political adaptation does not render leadership with a view and an appreciation for the need to maintain common infrastructure, to maintain common security, and to maintain certain basic elements, call it free market elements, or certain market and property rights and so on, or what makes for a flourishing society. And also a leadership in South Africa that doesn't seem to appreciate the legitimate interests of all the various communities in the country, but seeks to prioritize some parts over others. And now I know that's maybe different from the US context and some parts of Europe or other parts of the West, which have been monoethnic for a very long time. South Africa has been, at least in this huge dimension that it's been for the last 120 years, a multi-ethnic arrangement. And I think part of the challenge here is accepting that state failure will likely increase, and then thinking through what that means for filling the vacuum with alternative institutions and alternative market mechanisms from the bottom up.
I'd like us to paint the picture, paint the painting, probably is the right metaphor, of what it actually looks like out here on the ground. So you've been taking me around to various different locations. Some of your colleagues have been able to see much of Pretoria and Cape Town and other locations as well. Tulbagh was fantastic, a little paradise actually. But I think the degree of the decline is something that I was not aware of until I came out here. Right? You look sort of railroads. One, many of them are just no longer in use. It's no longer safe. Cargo would be stolen. It looks like the lines that the trains previously would have gone along have been stripped out in many cases. So the rail is simply just not running. Second, the roads. I mean, last night we went to a main artery that simply ends because there was a illegal mining collapse underneath it, and the road was simply never repaired. And now it's just covered in trash, disrepair, and the rest. You of course have potholes and such in other locations. Some areas are quite well maintained, in other areas it's just total chaos. You could think about electricity also. I've also seen sort of the locations where the copper wire is stripped out. People have been talking about how alternatives to copper wire that are much less conductive and totally a terrible option, I think it's aluminum if I recall correctly, are being used because it sells for less in the black market and is less likely to be stripped out. So there's the powers in question. We move again over to water, and just talking with members again of your team and such, how the water is not reliable in terms of it just turning on when you turn on the faucet in certain pockets of this area, and then also in terms of just it being clean anymore because the facilities are no longer capable of processing the water that's the sort of the source water, because of much of the pollution from the encampments and such that have been the settlements that have been building up. So that's some of what I've been seeing personally. You have more of the you've been here for far longer, of course, you and your family and your people before you. So can you help us build out the picture of what the infrastructure collapse actually looks like here.
Yeah, the common infrastructure in South Africa is under serious stress, and it's led to what you can possibly also describe even as the de-industrialization of some parts of South Africa. Now, it's not like there aren't any trains running, or there aren't electricity. I mean, you've been here, you've been well fed, and we've kept you safe. And
my phone is charged. What can I say?
We can even record a podcast, and it'll reach the rest of the world.
Yeah.
But it's a country of great variation, and in different areas, and depending much on the strength of the communities and to the extent that they fill that vacuum, or businesses and the ingenuity with which they can overcome or bypass certain obstacles, find alternatives to alternative transport mechanisms, arrange for their own security of cargo, and so on. So it's not like it's not like it's a complete disorderly, anarchic, chaotic place, South Africa. We can live a good life here, but there are heightened dangers and heightened challenges. Still, we think that with concerted effort, there is enough of a capital base in this country, enough of a skills base, and enough of a commitment by groups, including Afrikaners, of which I'm a member, but also other groups in this country, Westerners, also non-Westerners, to stick it out and to make it work. But I'm increasingly skeptical of whether that change is going to come through the voting mechanism. Recently, there was in Northwest. It's a little bit like the Wild West. Let's call it the Wild Northwest. It's this province within South Africa, and there's lots of deterioration there. It's actually sort of the coalface of state failure in some areas. We're involved there trying to recover some of the order and getting some of the businesses, insisting them in restoring order to that community. Now, what was interesting is that one of the main political figures in that province went on television a few weeks ago and said, look, they're not even going to call new elections in that town because it's just going to lead to the same outcome. Now, this official was part of the ruling ANC. He's completely an establishment political figure there. It was very interesting to hear sort of how he explains that there's clearly a problem with the voting mechanism. I don't know if he appreciates fully what he's saying, but I think that the future of South Africa is rebuilding institutions and restoring order outside the state. And so that we, instead of, the typical Western model post-Westphalia and post-Berlin and conference and all that is you have a strong hierarchy, the state is up there, and, it's almost like it's God, because for the rest of society, it can tell exactly what everyone should do. But in South Africa, I think increasingly we will look at overlapping authorities. It's more of an unstructured authority structure. But whoever establishes their authority, whoever establishes from the ground up capabilities, I think will find new commonalities and new ways of governing this region called South Africa.
I think as it stands today, what I've seen here, again, observing as an outsider, is that the pockets where things are going quite well, right, where the power is the power and the water and everything is sort of quite functional, and even transit and security, things like that. It is often private sector solutions, right? And so I guess, could you talk to me a little bit more about your specific strategy? And I'll maybe compare it here to our strategy at New Founding, which I think there's many similarities. But one, I would say that I think we maintain, more hope for sort of electoral pathways being a way that this goes successfully, and the way that we proceed successfully into the future in America. Our work is in parallel or sort of separate. We're working on private sector projects that will complement the Trump administration in certain ways. And then if political power is lost in the U.S., then we still have vehicles that are able to continue the project and continue advancing our priorities. Here, that's not quite the case. You're making sort of this narrow bet on the private sector. Talk me through a little bit more about sort of the thinking behind your current tactics.
Right. So we think that the responsibility for a favorable business environment lies with business people themselves, not with the state. It has happened, and over the last several hundred years, the state has, as an institution, has solved for a good business environment or a worse one, but we've forgotten that actually the responsibility lies with ourselves. So we internalize that locus of control, and that means that we need to do two things. The first is that we need to reform the state where we can through litigation. So we've built what is probably an unprecedented litigation engine in South Africa. We litigate on this South African version of DEI in all its various forms. We litigate on infrastructure collapse. We litigate on security matters, and all of those either with an intention to get this to almost negotiate an alternative arrangement that is better for everyone involved through the courts. That has been working very well for us. In other cases where we think that there's actually no chance that the state will recover the possibility to implement, let's say, build some kind of infrastructure or restore economic order to a town, our litigation will actually be to get the court's recognition for alternative solutions. So we do lots of litigation, and we expect that to triple and double and triple over the next few years. And there's lots to be said for the way in which the courts in South Africa deliver good judgments. There are problems, of course. No courts are completely independent from the state, but they have a degree of separation.
We have our own problems with the courts in the U.S. too.
All right. Okay. So yeah. So, but litigation is a valuable lever to pull. So that's the first kind of thing we do. And the second kind is a more nascent and a broader category. We call that alternative structures. And in these alternative structures, we close our eyes and we just imagine for a moment, what if the state didn't exist? It's not like you have to fight the state. What just if the state didn't exist? What if there's a vacuum to be filled so that there can be a better economic order? What if we were to do this, commerce would be better, and the society around that, or the communities around that commerce would flourish? And I'll give you some examples of those. The first is that we are involved in town collapse, where we're not involved in the collapse, where we're involved in rebuilding those towns. And we foresee that over the next few years, many towns in South Africa will either decline significantly, and even some cities will decline. But there will also be those that recover, and they'll do so, we think, if the businesses in those towns pool their capital, pool their resources, and either on a for-profit or a not-for-profit basis, start solving for common security problems. Setting up security and patrolling of certain areas, making it safe and clean, doing administration that you'd normally expect from the town council to do, or the municipality. I think increasingly businesses will just have to do that. To give you an example, Nathan, of the state of failure, some town councils in South Africa, not some, many, do not have the ability to tell you what your utilities bill is and what your rates and taxes should be. They've just lost the capability to to serve you with an invoice. And so, but of course, you need to pay for common infrastructure. If you don't maintain it, things will collapse. So it's in businesses' interest to solve for that common good problem. And then some variation on that, I think, will be a lot. Then another form of an alternative structure that we undertake is international engagement or trade relations. It's not something that we advertise or spend lots of time in public on, but we have reached and have established wonderful relationships with diplomats and trade attaches from dozens of countries all over the world, most in the West, but also beyond the Western sphere. And we think that's important for, over time, changing and capitalizing on the changing sentiment towards South Africa. That South Africa's political arrangement and the policies of its government is harmful and destructive and will lead to a destabilization of not only South Africa, but possibly, I think, in fact, Sub-Saharan Africa is increasingly obvious. And as that becomes more clear, I think the opportunity set for leveraging international policy and trade arrangements in favor of reform becomes more and more promising.
You mentioned litigation, and one of the types of cases we've been discussing has been on the subject of land expropriation, specifically without compensation. Mm-hmm. Can you explain what that is and what you're doing about it?
The South African government has accepted, in the parliament has passed a law that says that land may be expropriated for zero compensation or nil compensation. And especially anything, actually any property can, but singled out in the legislation is land especially if it's held for so-called speculative purposes. Now, any developer knows that speculation is actually just timing your investment. It's not speculation. But in the South African political sphere, that is seen as speculation. And so that law has not technically become operational yet, but it increasingly looks like the South African government is planning and putting everything in place in order to expropriate at zero compensation. But not only has the law recently been passed, but there are actually cases of expropriation without compensation before the law has passed, and we're involved in some of those. We're litigating against some of these legislative changes, and the most recent one that we announced about a month ago, which wasn't well known publicly, is an area of about 30 hectares worth 30 to 60 million rand. That's about $2 to $4 million. And this was expropriated without compensation. And so these owners have been fighting for 6 years to get compensation. And if we don't reverse that, that'll be a terrible precedent in South Africa.
So this is something of a test case on the issue. Yeah.
Right. So, yeah, there's a test case going on right now, and it's not the only one. There are actually more test cases coming, and it's the official policy of government that they want to expropriate at no compensation.
We've also spent some time talking about the issue of licensing. And of course, what's interesting to me is that in the U.S., like almost every profession is sort of gate kept by this network of essentially like professional licenses that you need, whether it's to become a lawyer, a nurse, an accountant, whatever it is. And historically, these have been quite useful. You want to make sure that the people who you do business with or who are taking care of an important part of your life are actually competent. We've seen many of these have been quite politicized in recent years, but it's not at a crisis point, I would say, across most institutions in the U.S. Our credentialing systems are still, or licensing systems are still fairly good. Talk to me a little bit about how licensing relates to the South African form of DEI and such, and some of the fights that have been going on there.
Yes, in recent years, especially since the advent of the presidency of President Cyril Ramaphosa, the current president in 2018, the scope of licensing of whatever you do that needs a license has been expanding substantially. It's happened through the legislature, through parliament, but also just through ministerial or, let's say, political appointees' discretion, whether that's lawful or not. So you see the scope of licensing expanding. And that's a problem because you don't want the state to be a gatekeeper for all economic activity. Because even though sometimes that can function well, the risk is that things get attached to that. That's part of the risk. And in South Africa, that's what's happening with DEI. DEI, where in its South African forms, BEE and hiring, racial hiring requirements and so on, these are all now being attached to these licenses. And so to give you two examples, which is relevant to a U.S. audience because it affects U.S. companies. First one is domestic airline services, domestic air services, whether it's passenger air services or crop spraying or air ambulances, any of that, or drones even. The airlines, that service regulator in South Africa, beginning of last year, started requiring license holders to also have BEE compliance. That's ownership of black people. And if you have not enough black ownership, you're not going to get the license. We litigated against that, and that was significantly reversed, or notably reversed about 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago. The same thing, however, has happened to international airlines operating in South Africa. So about at the same time in the last 2 years, international airlines, not only from the US, but from Europe and from other continents, have been receiving letters saying that they're going to have to do some BEE transaction in order to get permission to keep flying in and out of South Africa. Now, they weren't, of course, going to give away ownership, right?
Yes, this included U.S. airlines, yeah?
Well, I don't want to speak for name companies,
okay,
but it happened to many major airlines all over the world. And companies those companies are not going to give away ownership.
Yeah.
So that's where the politicians in South Africa came up with a very interesting option. They're going to give you the equity equivalent option, which means that as much as you were required to actually give away as ownership or sell at a discount for ownership, they're going to give you the option to deposit that into a transformation fund. And that fund is then going to be at the discretion of these bureaucrats to dish out as they see fitting. And that's then considered as penance or enough of a payment to do business in South Africa. So I think that was the play behind sending all these airlines that message. It's the same thing that's kept, not the same, but similar to what kept Starlink, for example. Elon Musk is at least here it's well known that South Africa is one of the increasingly few holdouts against Starlink presence in the world, and that's because the requirements of BE is too onerous for Starlink.
Well, first of all, I would say congrats on the win on the former of the cases 6 weeks ago on the airline licensing issue. It's very exciting, and it speaks to the good work that you're doing here at Sakeliga. It's going to make a big difference here in the country. I want to talk now about migration. In the U.S., mass migration is increasingly understood as the biggest crisis we face. Piet, you've made the analogy of a horizontal line that goes across Africa and how it relates to migration, and especially migration to the West and the United States. Could you tell us about that?
I think the latitudinal line running across Africa, it's a migratory watershed, you can call it, is probably the most important line from a migratory perspective to the West, perhaps, all of the West, including especially the US. Let me say why. Migration in Africa generally goes in two directions. Either it goes north to Europe, to Canada in the Northwest, or to the United States. That can have various diversions or detours, but that's where the migration normally ends up. And why is that migration happening? Well, there are conflicts in some of those regions, or there are just the relative economic opportunities between those areas. It's just so, the delta is just so large that people move to these areas. And it's much better to be a minimum wage worker for a McDonald's in the United States or driving delivery cars there than to do it in the Sudan, where you drive over landmines. So now that line in Africa is held in place depending on the stability of South Africa. And South Africa is incredibly important economically, politically, for the whole stability of Sub-Saharan Africa. And that's because the agricultural produce, the developed markets, the capital structure in South Africa, the capital base, the transport lines, even though we discussed in what dire straits some of it is in, it's still just so much more advanced than what is generally available in Sub-Saharan Africa. And so if South Africa does well and is stable, that line is held in place. And most of the migration heads northward. And let's say that's halfway across Africa. But the worse South Africa does and the more destable South Africa is, the further down that line shifts. And people that had been before attracted to moving to South Africa or were stable in place because it was economically doing well enough because of the stability spilling over from South Africa. As soon as that line starts dropping because of the destability of South Africa, then everything above that line, which is now much more, now rather prefers to move northwest to Canada and to the United States. And I think that's why the stability of South Africa is actually so important from not only a Western perspective in general, but from a US perspective in particular.
Yeah, there's maybe two elements here that could be drawn out. One is that South Africa, with its many successful farms and such, exports a large amount of food up into sort of Central, Western, Sub-Saharan Africa in general.
Yes.
If the floor drops out there, then a variety of sort of refugee crises could emerge, which will have implications for the West. But it's not just the migration question. I would say that if we even think back to, let's say, Trump's priorities when he ran for office, it was first migration, and deportations, closing the border, famously ran on the wall in 2016. And the second one is trade. And I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on what sorts of win-win partnerships you think would be possible between the United States and a place like South Africa, especially the Westerners and the Western-aligned people who are here in South Africa, maybe across migration, trade, and whatever else you see here.
Well, let's start with maybe what wouldn't be a win-win situation. And let's start with the example of Zimbabwe. So when Zimbabwe collapsed because of land seizures and extractive policies, race-restrictive policies and so on under the Mugabe regime a few decades ago, and it's still collapsed today, most of those people, well, not most, but many Zimbabweans left. Millions have left the country, and most of them have moved south into South Africa. And today, whether you're from South Africa trying to do business in Zimbabwe or from the US trying to do business in Zimbabwe, your interests have been deteriorated because the country is much more difficult to do business with, and especially for an orderly kind of Western ethical approach, it's more difficult to do business in such environments. And so you will see, from whatever perspective you have adversaries, they'll start moving in there. And so I think that's how not to solve it. And no amount of family sanctions, targeted sanctions on Robert Mugabe, any of those actually prevented the collapse. And in fact, it may have even encouraged a reaction. And in some ways, point is the country is still collapsed. It's not the way to do it. So I think regarding to South Africa, I think there's an opportunity for the US to maintain its interests if it finds ways to subnationally differentiate between sections that are aligned with US priorities, whether they are Western or Western aligned or US aligned, wherever there are subnational groups in this huge, in many ways artificial country called South Africa, with its many variations. I think that's the opportunity for the US and trade, and especially with an administration in the US that appreciates the value of trade and the leverage that trade offers. I think there's an opportunity to subnationally differentiate and in such a way maintain strong business ties, maintain strong connections, instead of the countries drifting apart and the vacuums because South Africa is heading for a destabilized version of itself in the future. And the vacuum that creates will definitely be something adversaries would step into, or even if adversaries don't step into it, you'll see that collapse spilling out with an effect on that migratory watershed.
If you think about the US's posture towards the state of South Africa, there's the famous scene that made headlines. Of course, we all saw the clips of J.D. Vance, even Marco Rubio, Trump having the back and forth, very tense back and forth, playing the video and such to the president in South Africa. And I think what's interesting is being out here, the gap between the state structure and sort of the Western business owners and such out here, who, in my experience with them, are very sophisticated businessmen, generally very pro-West, very pro-USA. And I think the question becomes, how can the United States partner effectively with these actually very profitable and successful businesses that are out here without cutting favors to what is a very far left, sort of discriminatory regime that the Trump administration doesn't necessarily have any interest in partnering with?
Yeah, I think that the US's best bet for a stable South Africa and securing its interest here is maintaining those strong ties. Now, of course, that's possible if the current government in South Africa were to change its mind and come to terms with the US requirements. US requirements, as we understand them and as they've been expressed from the White House, include get rid of the idea of expropriation without compensation, stop this BEE, DEI thing that you're doing, and don't protect the farmers, especially the Afrikaner farmers, which your political rhetoric or the political rhetoric you as a government keep allowing is harming. So those are some of the key things that have been coming either in the Trump's executive order or from the White House. And now it's possible that the South African government could say those are all reasonable.
But they haven't, yeah.
But they haven't.
To date, yes.
So I think the presumption in what I also said earlier, but maybe it's good to make that clear, is I think it's fair to say that it's likely that the US will maintain elevated reciprocal tariffs or elevated trade measures against South Africa based on the unwillingness of the South African government to come to terms acceptable to the US. And if that's the case, if the US then maintains only a national approach at that elevated level of trade barrier, reciprocal trade tariffs, making trade difficult, it will cause the countries to drift further apart and the countries as a whole. Whereas, as I just like to emphasize, subnationally, there are lots of groups within South Africa, and especially, of course, among Western groups, but also Western aligned groups, US aligned groups that like the US, who actually can be tapped. But then that just requires a willingness to come up with creative ways to, whatever the national policy is, find ways to get back to baseline sort of tariff and trade agreements for subnational, whether it's jurisdictions or companies that don't do DEI. I think those are all ways in which, regardless of whether local people like it or not, I think it's advisable from a U.S. interest perspective.
Is there any precedent for this sort of subnational trade agreement?
Oh, definitely. I mean, currently from the South African government side, there are subnational arrangements. For example, chicken imports from the US into South Africa. There are rebates in place for those imports, only if you're black or if your company is sufficiently black owned. So 50% of the tariffs, you have to be 100% black, and 50% of the rebates for the tariffs, you have to be sufficiently black owned, sufficiently high, called BEE score. So that's actually a South African tariff.
Coming soon in America if Trump doesn't maintain his position, if the right doesn't maintain his position.
You'll know better than I would. But so there's actually that and other precedents are actually in place. And so South Africa's International Trade Administration Commission earlier this year, it announced that it's going to increase it's going to increase its race restrictive import and export permits to 85 over the next 5 years. So US businesses are going to face race restrictive policies depending on who they want to do business with in South Africa. So there's already precedent from the South African side. And then there is precedent from the US side. In the 1970s, 80s, there was something called the Sullivan Principles, which was a voluntary code of ethics that I think at several hundred US businesses subscribed to, who were doing business in South Africa at the time. And it boiled down to a statement of opposition or a signal of opposition to the apartheid policies, the race-restrictive apartheid policies of the National Party government before the ANC of the 70s and 80s. Now, it did have a civil rights flavor, and it did advocate for some affirmative action measures in its own way, but still those were company-level discretions. And its core precedent that's relevant here is that it was a US-driven measure that made a difference of whether you could be invested in for doing business in South Africa or not, to whether you were pressured to leave the country based on against the race restrictive measures of that government. So there's actually historical precedent from the US side, and then there's current US precedent from the US side. I think recently an executive order in January or February, President Trump said that federal contractors, not only in the US but also in Europe, and I think some letters were sent to European federal contractors saying that if you want to stay as a federal contractor, you have to get rid of DEI measures, and you have to get in line with non-discrimination clauses, not the affirmative action version that you had been implementing. So it's actually not unprecedented, and I think there are ways in which the US can leverage some of that precedent in its own interest. And of course, I'm saying that because I think it's going to be beneficial here as well, but I think, truth be told, it has to make sense from a US perspective.
We've talked about migration, what happens in South Africa. If the floor drops out here, the instability that could create a sort of a crisis where there's pressure for more migration into the West. We've also talked about trade, and there's some opportunities there for really beneficial, just win-win, positive sum games between sort of aligned Western people. But there's also sort of this third angle of security, geopolitics. I'll tell a personal anecdote. Just driving by the China embassy here, it's unbelievably massive, and I'm not. This is not me trying to pump China here, but I would just say, sprawling architecture, really beautifully done, people coming and going. And the US embassy here, smaller, right? And this like brutalist 1960s sort of piece of architecture and such. And, maybe we don't want to read too much into that, but there are definitely, in this emerging multipolar order, there are powerful countries or powerful, let's say competitors who are interested in this place because of its sort of strategic location. Like, what do you think the Western interest is more from a geopolitical perspective in South Africa?
Well, South Africa, being at the southern tip of Africa, is the area from which the sea routes around the Cape of Good Hope is controlled. And that becomes especially relevant if the Suez Canal gets blocked. It's the major way to get then get cargo shipped freight across the world. It's not the one most used right now, but it becomes very important in some scenarios. Then also there's the base that offers into influence across Africa. And when states deteriorate and when regimes lose their ability to effectively control and exert their authority in a region, whether it's South Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, the role South Africa has played as its authority and its ability to exert influence diminishes. You will see inevitably regions, great powers vying to gain that influence. That's more relevant from a US perspective. From our perspective, as Sakeliga, of course, it's much more preferable for us to have familiar cultural and Western groups involved here, but it's not like South Africa has the capacity or to make a difference in that. So back to the question of what is the political relevance and the geopolitical relevance, I think it has to do with trade routes, and I think it has to do with how the US expects itself to find allies and aligned and friendly groups in Africa. And I think being a Western-oriented and Western country, the US, and with a significant Western minority in South Africa, and with groups that are familiar with a Western minority, I think South Africa is just your natural spot for striking stable and long-term relationships.
Well, Piet, thank you so much for joining the New Founding podcast and also for hosting me here in South Africa. The work that you're doing with Sakeliga, it strikes me as very similar in ambition to what we're trying to do in New Founding, but we're in radically different contexts. So it's just been so exciting to exchange ideas, discuss tactics. Just want to say thank you for hosting me in this beautiful and interesting place.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to have you, Nathan, and we look forward to learning and lessons from New Founding as well.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for listening to this episode of the New Founding podcast. New Founding has become a rallying point for founders and investors who are taking serious bets in the face of a stagnant business culture. Our venture fund backs early-stage startups focused on critical civilizational problems. If you're interested in pitching your company or investing in our fund, check out newfounding.com/venture. and follow the link to apply. You can also follow us on X @NewFounding and @NAT Halberstadt, HALBERSTADT.